history and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Friday weekend edition. We're so grateful that you can join us. And today we have, as always, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who, of course, is a columnist and author of a book that I'm going to hold up. Might as well hold it up right now. On the Edge, America Faces the Entitlement Cliff. We're going to be getting into the whole issue of health care in just a few minutes. But Holly Randall is back with us after working with Judge Ho, Associate Counsel at First Liberty Institute. And so we've got lots of things to cover. But let's start out, Holly, since you are here for the first time in quite a while. We have a case that I've posted up here about a nativity restored. Ohio City backtracks on the ban on a religious imagery. I thought we had a Supreme Court case that said it was okay to have things like nativity scenes. What about this?
We did, and First Liberty is well acquainted with it. I'm so happy to be back here talking about everything going on with First Liberty's cases, and this is a great one to start with because it's a win that we were able to get because we could build on a previous win that we've already achieved. So the Coach Kennedy case, everyone probably remembers that story from a couple years ago. He was a coach that wanted to pray at the 50-yard line. And you're probably listening thinking, what does that have to do with a nativity scene, somewhere on the East Coast? He was in Washington. So it's just a testament that the Lord can use facts for all different sorts of wins. And so his case got rid of some precedent that would have prevented something like a nativity in the past. And so we could go to this city and say, hey, you're kind of applying old law. We got rid of that in Kennedy. Our client wants to host a nativity at our Christmas market, and it's, totally fine under the new history and tradition test that the court ushered in because we have a rich history and tradition of religious celebration in this country. And so we were able to get a win for our client, and there may be some live animals somewhere coming to a Christmas market near you.
They're great. I wanted to do this one because I know we're getting into the Christmas season, although it's not even Thanksgiving yet. And there are going to be others that are going to be told, no, you can't have a nativity scene, and it's important. And Dr. Matthews, you and I are a little bit older than, a lot older, I guess we should say, than Holly. We remember back at Pawtucket, Rhode Island was one of those cases where they said, well, we might allow a nativity scene if you have some reindeer and Santa and a few other things. I think we've gotten away from that insanity to the fact that we've instilled at least a little bit of common sense in terms of the law.
And Kerby, for people who aren't as old as us, growing up as a youngster, you would see nativity scenes. Yes. I mean, cities all over the country would put out, towns would put out nativity scenes. They were in the public space. Nobody seemed to think anything about it. I don't remember anybody even being offended by it. But that all changed once you got into the 70s and 80s, and we may be getting back there.
Yes. But again, one other point before I move on to some others, Holly, this has to do with this whole issue of what was called the lemon test. And this has to do with the fact that whether it's a nativity scene or later on you're going to have young children and young adults that are going to be told, well, you can't talk about Jesus in a speech or at a valedictorian message, or you can't have a Bible study. These all kind of fit all together in the fact that we've got more religious freedom than we've ever had in recent memory.
Absolutely. And that line drawing that you were talking about, Dr. Matthews, where it was like, if your nativity featured a snowman in the background, the typical landscape of Bethlehem, snowy Bethlehem, it would be totally fine. And it just goes to show the arbitrariness of the lemon test. It was this judicially created doctrine. It's nowhere in our Constitution. And it allowed judges to dream up all of this stuff like, well, if you want to talk about your faith at a graduation speech, but don't make it proselytizing, but you can say it, but don't tell anyone, they should also know Jesus. It was just a whole mess of doctrine and precedent. No one knew what was, legal and could be done under the law. And so, like you said, we're getting back to what used to be, which is really great because it's a much easier landscape to work through if you're a citizen wanting to promote your faith in the public square.
So 20 1920s are the new 1950s.
That's right.
That's very good. Let me take another one real quickly, and that has to do with the fact that you have, in many places around the country, whether it's Fellowship of Christian Athletes or other Christian groups for athletes. Now, as I think we've mentioned before, you're an athlete and you can appreciate the value of having a Christian outreach, which can be available, but you have been dealing with, again, one of those issues that simply argues that, well, we can't have a Bible school, a Bible club on campus. We can't have a Christian campus event that has any kind of evangelistic outreaches, and you've been dealing with that one as well, haven't you?
Yeah, it's amazing these kind of cases still occur because it seems like something we've figured out by now, but it happens that, people have an understanding of the law from this era where there couldn't be any mention of religion at public schools, and now we know that that's not the case. And so we have a client in Tennessee, and he and his sons want to have a faith-based club at their school, and they're kind of getting the runaround from the district on, trying to figure out what the law is. And so we were able to send a letter to the district clarifying, hey, these students have rights and rights abundant to do these sort of things. And so we just want to encourage you to, allow those students to enjoy their First Amendment rights.
And do most schools and so forth acquiesce when that kind of thing happens?
Yeah, there's actually a federal law. It's called the Equal Access Act. I'll get real nerdy lawyer on you for a second.
1984, if I remember right.
It protects these kind of, to us we would say religious, but in the federal law it's sort of ideological, philosophical, moral-based clubs in secondary schools. And it says if you let them have the chess club, you've got to let them have the good news club. And that's basically the governing principle of religious clubs at schools. And
but you used to get a lot of pushback on these kinds of things. Is there less of that now?
There is now. Because of the Equal Access Act, the school districts have to certify to the federal government, basically, we're complying with this, we're following the law. And so that helps with issues like this when they arise. And it's just sometimes you have to remind districts about, the certification you made. So it's surprising how often they pop up. Usually it's just people need to be informed, and that's all it is. And so it's helpful to get to talk about it on places like this where maybe someone's listening and can go to their administrator and say, hey, we let people have, religious clubs at school, right?
Yep. Dr. Matthews, for just a minute, I thought it was kind of interesting. This is Smith County in Tennessee. And, of course, they have a case that's going to the Supreme Court from Mississippi, not allowing an evangelist to actually have a public space. And so there's always been this mindset, I think, that, well, we're going to run into some of the problems with religious liberty in the blue states, but many of these are coming from the red states. Isn't that interesting?
And sometimes that's because some of the cities in the red states are blue cities.
Yes,
and
there
you may
go.
get some pushback from that. But, it's interesting because when you go back to Billy Graham, he was in public spaces time and time and time again.
Yeah. Well, they have one that actually, is taken as the Cambridge School, and that's actually where, interestingly enough, Billy Graham was preaching.
Yes.
But later on, they said, well, it's a secular microphone, didn't
Right,
it?
that's in Florida, and First Liberty is here in Texas, and we have Texas cases pop up. So it can happen to anyone, anywhere. The most important thing is just to know when you can stand up, because that makes our job a lot easier.
Yes. Well, again, if you are not familiar, just go to firstliberty.org. If you're aware of a case like this, we did want to focus on that. We come back, though, we have the longest government shutdown that's ended, and that's begun quite a debate about the issue of health care. So we'll get into all of that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Europe is moving quickly to make sure that every person in every country has a digital identification on their phone. Michael Brendan Doherty dreads that the rush to digital ID is creepy. He begins by acknowledging some of the benefits. For example, instead of handing your driver's license over to a bouncer who then learns your name, address, home state, exact birth date, and what class of vehicle you've been licensed to drive, you could simply confirm via your phone that you're over 21 and allowed into a bar. Since I never go to a bar, I don't see much of an advantage, But I know that the European Union will use this example and many others to illustrate how a digital ID will be more convenient and offer greater privacy. You'll also find arguments that it will cut costs and even help fight terrorism. What concerns him is the attempt to bundle so many systems and databases together. If there is a problem with the digital ID, it could leave someone locked out of their life. And it could be easily hacked. He reminds us that hundreds of millions of accounts with Adobe, JP Morgan Chase, and Facebook were exposed because of hackers. He is also concerned that this data risks becoming a giant data panopticon for the continent. But the greatest concern is how Europe's digital ID bears a striking resemblance to the front end of a Chinese-style social credit system. 7 years ago, I wrote the booklet, A Biblical Point of View on Privacy and Surveillance. What was theoretical then is closer to reality now. That's why we should be concerned about digital IDs being developed in Europe. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation a little bit later, we'll open up the phones. But we've had the longest shutdown in American history. Second largest shutdown happened just a few years ago, and that was Democrats once again against Donald Trump. I don't know if there's a coincidence there, but nevertheless, this one went very long. And in a few minutes, Dr. Matthews will talk about the issue of health care, because that's one I think we really need to focus on, because more and more people are saying, well, now we've ended the shutdown, we'll have this ongoing debate about health care policy, which I want to get to. But for just a minute, it was difficulty in trying to at least come up with enough Democrats to actually get to this 60-vote limit. And given the fact that Rand Paul was not going to vote for it, you had to get one more. So at least they were able to find a few individuals, Democrats and independents, if you consider Angus King an independent, to get it through the House, the Senate. And then they had to turn right around and get just enough votes for the House. And again, you had two Democrats, two Republicans, and 6 Democrats voted in favor, 2 against. I mean, it just was tight all the way through.
It was tight all the way. And there's been a lot of discussion about it, as a lot of Republicans have said Democrats caved. I don't know that that's entirely fair. Some Democrats, I mean, as you said, a handful, 7 Democrats in the Senate decided to go along with this. They're considered a little more moderate among the Democrats. None of them are running for re-election. A few of them are this is going to be their last term. So they decided to go along with the 60-vote filibuster. That means that's what you have to get in order to close debate so you can have the vote. So once you shut debate down, then you can have the vote, and they don't actually have to even vote for it then.
Right.
You just have to have a majority at that point. But it was interesting because the discussions have been going on that this was all about health care. Chuck Schumer, the minority leader in the Senate, has said that. But some others have come up and said, no, this really wasn't about health care. This was about showing the base, the progressive base that was so upset with Chuck Schumer for signing off on the legislation, the budget legislation last, January, February, that they had to show that they were going to stand up against this and would not cave. And of course, Chuck Schumer did not cave on this. But some of them are going to say it was just trying to demonstrate to the Democrats out there, the voters, that they could stand up on principle and hold their ground on something. So it's interesting to see how this is going to play out, because a number of Democrats said, we did very well in the elections last week. And because we did very well, we should have held on to our fight and been able to win this battle. And I'm not sure they were ever going to win it, because you've just got somebody who's just awfully stubborn in the White House.
Well, and the other part of it is that some people are saying now that the off-year elections were off, and we're talking about Virginia and New Jersey, and of course the mayor of New York City, which we've all talked about a few times here. Then it became less important, but nevertheless, here we are finally with a government that eventually is going to be functioning, because it still takes a few days to get everybody in the right spots.
As someone with a lot of plane tickets sitting on my phone waiting to be used. I'm very thankful that I'm no longer. I mean, you're always going to have to worry about delays, right? But, in honesty, I know friends that were furloughed, and I knew people that were not getting paid, but they were working. And so I think, all of us are for limited government. We want to see, the size of the federal government shrink. We want to see good fiscal management. But it is good just the human cost of the shutdown that was starting to occur. Seeing, my church was standing up on Sunday and talking about food pantries in the DFW area and who we should be giving money to and resources to or donations in kind just to help people. And so that's something that can't be lost in all of the discussing, numbers and policies and elections is just there was a lot of people that got swept up in this, and it changed, whether it's their month, their year, their 43 days, or the rest of their life. It'll be interesting to see the ramifications of this, both electorally and just in, people.
A few elements of it, they pushed the funding through the end of January,
right.
So this wouldn't happen at Christmas.
Yeah.
and
they moved SNAP to September, if I remember right.
Yes.
And I think we all said 42 million people get SNAP. I mean, now all sorts of people have been asking about that. Sometimes when they're trying to focus on one issue, everybody goes, I didn't know we had that many people. We've done that with SNAP and a variety of other issues that all of a sudden bring to the fore some concerns that people have been talking about as well. So I've got a commentary coming out next week that just talks about some of the economic issues because all those individuals, almost 700,000, if you take those that were furloughed and those who were working without pay and all that, weren't paying their car loans, weren't paying all sorts of mortgage payments, didn't have income. And so as a result, we ran up the Treasury account, the TGA, and all of a sudden the banks don't have the money, so they're pulling out of the repo fund. I won't get into all that, but the long-term implications are significant, and even the fact that now, for the first time, people are starting to say, do we really have 42 million people get SNAP? Maybe we should think about that a little bit as well. So they didn't maybe anticipate, as you never do when you start one of these, what would be the unintended consequences.
And, of course, one of the things that the government did was it tracked how many people are on SNAP, how many people are unemployed, how many people have got new jobs, and so how many people got laid off, and a lot of that has been put on hold for right now. So you have the Federal Reserve Bank that will go into its next meeting in December, sort of flying blind on what it should be doing.
That was the other thing I was going to bring up.
And so it just
totally blind.
Just yesterday, a couple of Fed governors came out and said, I'm not as sure that we should cut interest rates again, and the stock market tanked once they said that.
And they always have this bet on whether or not they're going to lower the rates, and it's about 50-50 right now. I think it's 57-43, something like that.
Yeah, it's roughly 50-50. It had been around 60 or 70 that they'd cut rates, and back before, right after they cut rates, and Jerome Powell came and said, you can't guarantee we're going to do this. It was like 90% that they were going to do another rate cut, and the market wants a rate cut.
Yeah. So you raised some other good issues, which we'll probably talk about next week when we get into the Federal Reserve. As a matter of fact, the latest issue of Outlook is on the Federal Reserve. So if you haven't received that, you should be looking for it in your mailbox. But I thought just before we go to the break, this was one that relates to both Dr. Matthews, one of his favorite topics, tariffs, and it also relates to the Supreme Court, so I got a judge, and that is Dr. Merrill Matthews. Those judges are not fools. Now, I did read on the other day George Will, who had said that when the Solicitor General, that's John Sauer, has to make the case for the Trump tariffs, the justices are going to have to stifle some giggles, and that's kind of what you're saying here, isn't it?
Yes, and I actually saw, because I was listening to it online as it was happening and following some of the tweets that was happening, and a few people said when he made a couple of those statements, he said the audience laughed out there. Laughed at some of the things.
You don't want laughter in the Supreme Court, I don't think. You don't want
laughter in the Supreme Court at your argument, which always makes me wonder, when you come in and you're making an argument that is clearly not well grounded, and the Supreme Court justices are looking at this and saying, now let me see if I understand what you're saying. You're saying such and such. How the Supreme Court justices actually respond to that, because as a officer of the court, you're supposed to be in there telling the truth, and if you're making a case that nobody believes, what does that mean? I just don't even understand how that works.
I do not envy John Sauer in this position. I think you're exactly right. It was he was put in a really tough place. And there's kind of an old adage that, if the law is on your side, argue the law. If the facts are on your side, argue the facts. And if you're in John Sauer's position here, I don't know what you say, because I think you hit the nail on the head. He was making some statements that were tough to make as an attorney. You probably just felt a little bit like, I'm going to do my best, and that's all I can do. But the justices are smart. He's smart. I don't know who is arguing as opposing counsel. I'm sure it's someone very smart, very qualified. So I'm confident that, the outcome will be highly intelligent. But yeah, it did feel a little bit like when you were listening to it, like, what are we saying here?
Yes, because again, the Constitution requires that Article 1, the Congress has the power to tax. And so to get around that, the Solicitor General had to say, well, these were just sort of incidental. It's so incidental that I think President Trump is talking about a $2,000 STEMI check. That doesn't sound too incidental to me, right?
It wasn't. And in his inauguration speech, he said, we're going to look at setting aside the Internal Revenue Service and creating an External Revenue Service because we're going to be taking in so much money from these tariffs.
So anyway, you can read this piece. Dr. Matthews places his tongue in cheek rather significantly, and it is one that was on the Hill. Those justices are not fools, and I don't think anybody was fooled. And it will be interesting to see. I think we can predict that some of the tariffs that actually have been implemented by Donald Trump will be declared unconstitutional, so we'll find out. But nevertheless, it's a piece that I want you to read, but I think most of you are probably wanting to know about how to think about this issue of health care, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And so that's a piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews and some other great facts. We're going to try to educate all of us around the table right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Holly Randall as well as Merrill Matthews in studio, and we give you an opportunity, if you'd like, after we've maybe brought some discussion to the table about this issue of health care, because just as the shutdown is ending, the debate now about health care is really surfacing. And Dr. Matthews wrote this back when he was still talking about the shutdown dragging on. Now it's over, but the bottom line is how Republicans can make health care affordable. And in some respects, Dr. Matthews, we're going to go back to some conversations that take us back to how the Affordable Care Act was passed. It was passed in the United States Senate by just Democrats.
Yes.
And so I thought it was really interesting as I read a piece the other day that simply said, would you believe that Obamacare is suddenly and unexpectedly on the brink of financial collapse only because Republicans won't rescue it? And yet they were the ones that told you in the first place it wasn't going to work. And I think we're now finding out it didn't work.
So just so the listeners remember, it was on Christmas Eve that they passed it by 60 votes, all Democrats. They had 60 votes. They could shut off debate. So it passed. The Senate version passed in the end of 2009. And then Nancy Pelosi, because it had to go back to the House, and Nancy Pelosi had to come up with a sort of a funny way of trying to do the rules so that they could pass what the Senate had done. And it finally got passed. Barack Obama signed it in 2010, and so you had Obamacare. But the basic insurance didn't start until 2014, though the website went up in October 2013, and people remember, I suspect, that the website crashed. Nobody could get into it. It was a mess. And that got Barack Obama saying, government just doesn't do technology well.
The website being a mess was just like a foreshadowing of the healthcare system to come.
Yes, it was. And Holly, you were in college at the time, but you remember that, don't you? And the healthcare website isn't working as well as the websites that you were using probably every day as a student?
Yeah, I told you guys when we came in that I remember like my first memory of talking about healthcare was the website. Like that's my first healthcare news story that I can reach back in my brain and remember to being a student. And I'm like, this is not going to go well. That exposed early the lie to me that government was good at creating things. And, we needed private industry to develop websites.
So I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal in January or February of 2013 saying, here's what's going to happen to the system. It's going to, because of the way they structured it and they ignored all actuarial principles, premiums are going to rise significantly. And that'll be masked by some of the subsidies that were provided,
right.
But premiums are going to go very high. And at some point, people will say, I'm young, healthy, I don't go to the doctor very much. Why in the world do I want to pay this much money for health insurance when I don't need it or don't go to the doctor? And so young, healthy people will start dropping out, and that will leave the pool smaller and sicker, and premiums will go up even more. And that's what we call a death spiral in the insurance market. And we're seeing that now. One of the reasons that the Democrats, as Holly pointed out, the Democrats at the pandemic put enhanced subsidies in there. So we got enhanced subsidies now. Those are ending at the end of this year. And so Democrats are desperate to keep those enhanced subsidies. So you get, it has normal subsidies, then they put in enhanced subsidies.
That's amazing.
And they want to keep those in order to mask the price of the premiums that are going up so high. And they would eventually have to go to enhanced subsidies to the enhanced subsidies in order to be able to keep the prices affordable. So that's exactly what would happen. And so now, if the enhanced subsidies are going to end at the end of this year, you will start seeing some people dropping out of the system because the premiums are so high. And I just had a friend mention something the other day. He said he and his wife they don't have employer-based health insurance. They both have a bronze plan. They both have an $8,000 deductible each. $16,000 for the two of them, a deductible. And you may remember, Kerby, when we were talking about this back in the 2000s, we would say, well, we like high deductibles, maybe $2,500 for the whole family, and then you have a health savings account. Right. And Democrats said, you must be in the pockets of the insurance company. You must be an insurance company shill. Who can afford $2,500? And now it's $8,000 for an individual in some of those bronze plans.
Let me get to Holly for just a minute, because that's where the age issue is important, because what essentially this required is for you and very young people who generally don't use health care as much to be forced into a plan with older people that probably use a disproportionate amount of health care. And how many times on our Next Generation Roundtable or other conversations have we said how unfair it's already been for the younger generation, saying, I'm not sure I've ever been able to own a home. I've got all these incredible student loans and all this other thing. And then you forced me into a health care program where I'm paying a lot more than I should so that I can fund the older generation. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, and it's a wonder why. I mean, I'll disclaim myself from this piece, but it's a wonder why you get young people that vote for candidates like Mamdani in New York, because we have these like social structures that are being built that kind of leave us in a position, like you just said, funding, healthcare and rising costs of healthcare and inability to buy homes. And, I think the people that elected Mamdani in New York probably need to look into the consequences of the solutions he's proposing. But I think we're missing a lack of education on how do we solve this problem for young people. And so they run to those solutions that aren't going to work, because the problem is definitely there and we feel it. We just need better education on how to solve it.
And as you point out, Kerby, essentially young people are subsidizing older people.
Yes.
And initially Democrats wanted to have everybody paying the same premium, which is a great deal for older people who use a lot of care and not a great deal for young people who don't go to the doctor. So they eventually changed it a little bit. So older people are charged a little more than younger people, but the young are still subsidizing older people in that. And the Democrats were warned about this, and they said, oh, well, in that case, let's impose a mandate to make everybody have health insurance, so you young people wouldn't try to escape the health insurance paradise of Obamacare, and then we'll provide them with big subsidies so the taxpayers be footing the bill. It was all an effort to politically engineer a health insurance system the way the Democrats wanted it to work, rather than the way real insurance works when people are making their own choices.
One of your articles here, of course, is the issue of the biggest pot of wasted taxpayer money, and I'll hold up your book again, Medicare, Medicaid fraud, which has become so easy that organized crime is increasingly using it as well. We had a piece yesterday where they were also talking about the fact that under the Obamacare exchange plan, there are enrollees who do not use their coverage. They're called phantoms. And the graft, corruption, and fraud call Doge back in, because this is the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and the issue of phantom people, we don't know if they're people, young, healthy people who just don't use much health care. We used to say back when I was years ago in a think tank, we were looking at this, and we'd say roughly half the people don't use any health care at all during the year, and the next 20-30% use, a fair amount, and then another 10 or 20% really use most of it. It's that sort of 80-20 rule that we sometimes talk about. So we don't know what's happening there. We do know back in the 2000s, U.S. organized crime got into this. In fact, there was an article back several years ago that the banana crime family in New York had moved to Florida because that's where the Medicare fraud was.
Yes.
And now what's happened is that increasingly foreign organized crime, and so I mentioned a couple of pieces there. Russian-backed criminal organization was able to extract, I think, about $10 billion out of the system by filing these false claims. Yeah. And then a Pakistani-backed group were able to use AI to create fake people got something like $700 million. And the Justice Department has found these, but this, I argue, is just the tip of the iceberg.
Of course,
because so much fraud goes on out there.
Well, I need to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about this idea of health savings accounts, because in some respects, Holly, this gets into the idea that there isn't much of market dynamics here, and when somebody else is paying for it, you may be less paying attention to the cost. And the example I used yesterday is, let's imagine after we finish here, I say, okay, I'm taking everybody out for dinner, maybe early dinner. And I say, I'm going to put it on the Point of View credit card. By the way, somebody listening here, don't get scared. But if I did, you'd be paying a lot more attention to the left side of the menu. But if I said everybody gets to pay for their own, well, then you start looking at the right-hand side of the menu of the prices. And I recognize that some health care is emergency. You have a heart attack, you break an arm, but much of it is comparison shopping. And I remember a commentary years ago by Dr. Merrill Matthews talking about the wide disparity on coronary bypass surgery and things like that, where if we allowed even a little bit of a free market back into the healthcare system, we'd be a lot better off. So we want to talk about that. And again, that's on the second page where you do talk about this idea of health savings accounts and what could be actually achieved there. Because some of you might be saying, okay, you've identified the problem. It's big. What's the solution? Well, I think we have a few, and we'll talk about that right after this.
Like it or not, it's a boomer world. The huge and influential baby boom generation is still the most powerful presence in American society. Members of the boomer generation were born between 1946 and 1964. That puts President Trump, born in 46, at the generation's leading edge. As part of a recent symposium on boomers, cultural commentator Aaron Wrenn contributed an essay, The Boomer's World. He says boomers empowered the craziest of politics, but have also been the political balance holding back that crazy. Boomers are not a monolith. Many of us work against damaging phenomena like the green transition, DEI, and the LGBT agenda that were ultimately enacted on our watch. Boomers are often criticized for not stepping aside in a timely manner, not making room for succeeding generations and neighborhoods, organizations, politics, and corporations. Mr. Wrenn lists some boomer stereotypes. One, he says, is their refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of anyone's views but their own. To them, their own perspectives are simply the obvious truth. He continues, they don't think anyone else could possibly be as good at leading as they are. Another rap on boomers is they're selfish. They're leaving succeeding generations with a $37 trillion national debt, which Mr. Wrenn argues will be a millstone for their successors. Boomers have allowed mass immigration. Aaron Wrenn points out that when the boomers entered their 20s around 1970, America was at its lowest foreign-born population share ever. Yet, they created a world in which their own children will be racial minorities. Theologian R.R. Reno writes that early on, boomers cultivated a spirit of rebellion against the establishment. Ironically, boomers now look at the recent elections and worry that younger generations are driving us too far left. Okay, fellow believing boomers, we've done some damage. Since our generation still sets the cultural tone, we should use our influence to undo some of it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that this particular article by Dr. Merrill Matthews, Make Health Care Affordable, or basically the title is How Republicans Can Make Health Care Affordable, not only identifies the problems, and we've done that pretty well, but he also gives many solutions, and some have to do with dealing with legal loopholes, some have to deal with maybe revising or simply repealing some things under the Biden administration. But I thought we'd focus on one that I think most people can understand, and that is health savings accounts. Used to be called medical savings accounts. Goes back to Phil Graham, we had on the other day. Yep. And you're talking about large HSAs. Talk about that, because if indeed we want to inject any kind of competition into the market, thus lowering costs, that's a very effective way to do it. And many individuals, including people like Holly, who maybe aren't going to be using a lot of health care insurance, certainly could benefit from that.
If I remember right, there's about 37 million HSAs out there, and it covers about 61 million people, because a lot of those cover families. But yes, the legislation passed initially in 1996 called medical savings accounts. 2003, they became health savings accounts. And they're simply just a tax-free account where employers can deposit money into an account, and then you couple that with a high-deductible health insurance policy. So if you need major health insurance, you've got a policy, but you have the HSA. And what the HSA does is it puts the employee or the individual and into being the role of consumer in healthcare again.
Yes.
So now, instead of insurance paying for everything, you have money in an account that you can spend on lower, routine care and so forth. Because you get to keep that money and it can roll over tax-free and grow tax-free, you have an incentive as an individual to say, doctor, is a generic prescription just as good as a brand name? Because this is coming out of my HSA. So if I can do $10 for a generic rather than $75 or $100 for a brand name, that might be a good idea. In fact, I've had so many people, Republicans do this. They want hospitals and others going out and posting the prices of things. They want doctors posting their prices. And I keep telling them, if my charge is a $35 copay, I don't care whether my doctor charges $100 or $500. I'm out $35. In fact, I might be more willing to go to the $500 doctor because I think that doctor's better because he or she is charging charging a whole lot more. I might be wrong, but I might think that. So when you have hospital surgeries and somebody says, okay, we're going to do a gallbladder for surgery for $10,000 and another place over here does it for $25,000, if I'm paying $500 or $1,000 out of pocket, I don't care how much more it's going to cost. Mm-hmm. And so that's the missing factor in healthcare. We were trying to move in that direction. Obamacare came back and said, no, we want people to be more people covered for even more healthcare items so that we have even less of a reason to ask, where do I get value for my healthcare dollar out there? And as you point out, if I've been in an accident, I'm in an emergency room, I'm not asking the doctor a price about that. Yeah. But for the vast majority of cases, we see a doctor, we see a physician assistant, and we're talking about things that we can do. And just determining which family care doctor I go to or which specialist I go to, I have to have a reason to ask, where do I get value for that? Otherwise, we're going to continue expending so much money because I'll just put it like this. Imagine what would happen to demand for a Lexus if everybody could get it for a $50 copay. So that's what happens in our healthcare system.
I think so. And Holly, one of the things we've talked about before simply is the fact that when you get into some of these issues, people are unaware of the long-term implications that it might have. And in some cases, they want to have some freedom. For example, right now, there would be certain drugs on the formulary which are acceptable and others are not. And so one of the lines I used to make was simply this: if you are frustrated right now dealing with your insurance company, just imagine what it's like trying to deal with a faceless bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. that decides whether or not you can use this drug or not, whether or not this particular surgery is covered or not. And that's kind of the loss of freedom, and that's a big issue too.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and I think I've experienced even myself trying to find a doctor or get a new doctor, right? Like it's nearly impossible to get established as a patient with a dermatologist right now, just because some of these policies and insurance control and bureaucracy has led to just doctors not wanting to be doctors, and that's harmed people as well. And so I think there's so many downfall effects of this, of insurance companies' concerns about their sort of governing what doctors can offer as patients in course of care, and maybe that comes from government, maybe that comes from their sort of corporate control. Doctors feeling hamstrung and not enjoying the profession that they went into to try to help people. So I think there's a lot of side effects here, people missing out on care because of availability of health care. And all of this is kind of side conversation that goes on with what do we also do about the price, too?
Yeah.
Well, people will say, Democrats especially will say, competition doesn't work in healthcare. Consumers can't make these kinds of choices. But in fact, competition does work in healthcare. As we've talked about before, cosmetic surgeons, plastic surgeons oftentimes have a package price, so you don't get a list of 10 or 15 or 20 different things that are listed on there. You get a package price. You can go down the street to another cosmetic surgeon and find out what that package price is going to be, because this is typically paid for out of pocket. And there's a surgery center in Oklahoma. I think it's called like the Surgery Center of Oklahoma or something. They take no insurance whatsoever.
Right.
And they post their prices. You can go online and look at the prices, and I've gone and looked at what the price of a hip replacement and so forth, significantly less than what they will charge here. But the irony here is, and your listeners will know this, if you've gone to the doctor and you've had surgery and you've got insurance paying for it, when you get all the tabulation of all this, you'll see, well, the price of the surgery was $25,000, but the insurance is only going to pay $4,000 or something of that nature, because all the prices in healthcare, I'll use the term sham because they don't mean anything.
Yes.
Hospitals will say this is what we charge for that, but they've negotiated a deal with the insurance company to pay a lot less for that, or the hospital to pay a lot less. And so whatever they say is the real price isn't even the real price anymore. And consumers, the only way we're going to get real prices is when consumers say, I want to know how much this costs because I'm paying for it.
It's just like the illustration I mentioned a minute ago. If we go out there and there's a menu, but there's no prices on it, That's really what we do with healthcare right now. I want to continue this on, but let me also encourage those of you that maybe have a comment or a question. We will open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, because one of the things I mentioned a minute ago, and this is in your article as well, is the drug companies. Now, in the poorly named Inflation Reduction Act, which had really almost nothing to do with inflation reduction, it really was the Green New Deal. Even Joe Biden admitted that later on. There was a section in there called the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Provision, which, again, at the time, it was wonderful to just beat up on Big Pharma, but there are some implications, not the least of which in terms of the cost of the drugs and even reducing innovation. So when we come back from the break, I want to really get into that in a little detail because you've researched that as well. And it's easy to beat up on big medicine, big pharma, and everything like that. But this isn't an attempt to justify. It's an attempt to try to say, okay, we recognize that the Affordable Care Act is not affordable. The fact that you not only have subsidies, but now enhanced subsidies tell me that something has to change. And, okay, smart people around the table, what are you going to suggest to change? And I think this piece, along with the others that I posted by Byron York and Noah Rothman, just remind us a little bit more of the fact there are solutions, but you first, as I say on this program so often, have to admit there's a problem before you can start talking about a solution. Anybody paying attention should recognize that. So we're going to come back and get into that in some detail. And then we've got quite a number of other things to talk about in the second hour in addition to that. So stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we wanted to spend just a little bit more time talking about this issue of health care because it is a debate that no doubt you're going to have. First of all, you probably have had it already as you've tried to figure out how to take your scarce dollars and use those in an effective way. And right now, obviously, Holly and I were talking about the fact that it's kind of open registration, open enrollment, and all sorts of things right now. So you may be thinking about it. But also, this is going to be an ongoing debate. And sometimes you might say, okay, it's real easy to talk about the problems, and there are many with the Affordable Care Act, which is not affordable. Mm-hmm. Do you have some solutions? And we've talked about some. Then we'll get into some others. You might remember last week we got talking about this issue of antisemitism and Zionism and all the rest. We've got a good piece by Victor Davis Hanson, which we mentioned last week, but I've posted it for you to read in its entirety since it was behind a paywall. And a good piece by Ralph Reed, Evangelical Support for Israel is about more than theology. And by the time we're done, probably also talk about Penedexter's piece on Boomer World. But Dr. Matthews, let me come back to you and make you the expert because you have written this piece about the fact that when the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, I can't even say with a straight face because we knew it was not going to reduce inflation. They just used that as a term. But nevertheless, there was a price negotiation provision. At the time, it seemed like, well, we need this because of Big Pharma, but we even at the time knew what the problem was going to be because as a result, if you can't at least recoup the investment in research and development and clinical trials, you're not going to produce various kinds of drugs.
Right. And so what happens in the drug marketplace, the drug companies typically would sell to what's called pharmacy benefit managers.
Right.
Would come in and negotiate with the drug companies. They would negotiate discounts, and then what they're supposed to do is take them to the pharmacies then, and then pass some of those discounts on to pharmacies. Well, over time, let's just say that not as much of the discounts went to the pharmacies, and the PBMs have done very, very well over the years. And so one of the things that Mark Cuban did, former owner of the Mavericks, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, he set up Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drugs. And he set up a nonprofit group where they would go and buy the drugs directly from the pharmaceutical companies and put them up for sale online at their cost plus 10%. And it was the prices. They would say, this is our price. Here's what you'd be able to get it for at the pharmacy, and you'd see significant difference in lives. Now, if it's amoxicillin or something, there wasn't much difference, but for a lot of drugs, there was significant difference in the price. And so people were going to Mark Cuban's site and buying their drugs there, and they were going to eventually try to bring in insurance and do some other things and so forth. Well, what's happening is the drug companies now are starting to, because of the popularity of Ozempic and Wegovy, the ones that are the weight loss drugs, they're putting those up online. And they initially said, we're going to offer these for about half price of what we were selling for at the retail market. So it went from about $1,000 a month down to about $400 or $500 a month. And now they've cut a deal with President Trump, and he's going to allow them in Medicare, but now they're talking about lowering it down to about $150, $160 a month. But it's on their own website. You'll be able to go there and buy those. But what this points out is there's a lot of things going on in the healthcare field that ends up bumping up the prices. If you could just get access to these and you were able to pay for it out of pocket, you would find costs would go down significantly, just like they do in every other sector of the economy. And so people are going to start doing this. And I think we're going to see a lot of changes happening in the healthcare system if these changes are allowed to continue.
And again, you do talk about that because you have the so-called pharmacy benefit managers. And by bypassing the middleman, there are some really great opportunities. And all the way through your article, you're just talking about here's some problems, and these are reasonable solutions. And let's hope that at least some members of Congress will see these as reasonable. Because if you inject, Holly, just a little bit of common sense into the healthcare system and the pricing of all of this, we can reduce the costs that people pay every single month for insurance and for the various drugs and surgeries they get.
Right. It's been a decade since my last economics class, but I can pretty much still recite the idea that if you cut the middleman out, we're going to have better, it's going to be better for all people. And so I am hopeful that these, we'll call them innovations, but it just feels like going back to first principles of the economy. Yeah. hopefully legislators will find them reasonable, like you said, but you never know what interest, now I'll be the negative Nelly and take the rose-colored glasses off. You never know what interest they're looking out for. And that's kind of the reality that we're placed with.
It gets back to one of my iron laws of economics, which is the economizer must benefit from the economizing. If you want to have people looking for ways to save money and economize, they have to benefit from it. And right now we're in a system where they're trying to press people to go out and use a generic drug rather than a brand name drug. Well, why? I mean, generics, it's a little bit less expensive. But if, for instance, with some drugs, the Obama administration sort of made sure that they were considered preventive care, and so they get them free. And so I don't care if it's a $10 drug or a $150 drug if I get it free if it's a preventive care issue. Yeah. So if you want me to economize and be a value-conscious shopper out there in the healthcare marketplace, you got to give me a reason to be a value-conscious shopper.
And one of the things Holly was talking about is the fact that there are interests, and you might remember that when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was testifying a couple times, he was getting real pushback from everybody from Elizabeth Warren to Bernie Sanders, and he was pushing back the other way, reminding those on the other side how many of them are receiving any kind of campaign donations from Big Pharma.
Oh, yeah. The pharmaceutical industry does put out a lot of campaign donations because they are in the crosshairs of everybody. So they have to sort of cover their bases on both the Republican and the Democratic side.
So anyway, I just wanted to encourage people to maybe read this article, maybe find some of the other material that you've posted over the years, because in some respects we are recognizing that, as you point out, we are dealing with some areas of fraud, and you gave us a couple of examples from Russia and Pakistan, and how a crime family moves to Florida because that's the best place to engage in fraud with Medicare and Medicaid funds, and that certainly needs to be addressed. Of course, we've talked about some of these others, whether it's HSAs, whether it's getting rid of the middleman, or even talk about some of the legal loopholes with hospitals. But this is at least a possibility, and it does seem to me that if indeed this becomes a significant debate over the next month or two, you're going to be traveling to Washington, D.C., giving some more testimony.
It's possible because right now Trump and Republicans are saying we need to come up with a health care plan, because going all the way back to Obamacare, when I used to speak on this, when the debate over to Obamacare, they'd say, okay, you want to repeal Obamacare, what do Republicans want to replace it with? There was no plan. There were several Republicans had a plan, but there was no Republican plan, and they still don't. 15 years later, they still don't have a plan.
Yes, and again, so that's, I think, a very legitimate argument, and you'll probably hear that surfacing there as well. But did want to make some of that available to you. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's get into this whole issue of support of Israel, the issue of Zionism, anti-Semitism. That gets us into Tucker Carlson and a variety of other individuals, Candace Owens, we talked about yesterday, and on and on and on. So let's just get into it, and we'll see if we can cover that and maybe answer some of those questions right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Europe is moving quickly to make sure that every person in every country has a digital identification on their phone. Michael Brendan Doherty dreads that the rush to digital ID is creepy. He begins by acknowledging some of the benefits. For example, instead of handing your driver's license over to a bouncer who then learns your name, address, home state, exact birth date, and what class of vehicle you've been licensed to drive, you could simply confirm via your phone that you're over 21 and allowed into a bar. Since I never go to a bar, I don't see much of an advantage, but I know that the European Union will use this example, and many others, to illustrate how a digital ID will be more convenient and offer greater privacy. You'll also find arguments that it will cut costs and even help fight terrorism. What concerns him is the attempt to bundle so many systems and databases together. If there is a problem with the digital ID, it could leave someone locked out of their life. And it could be easily hacked. He reminds us that hundreds of millions of accounts with Adobe, JP Morgan Chase, and Facebook were exposed because of hackers. He is also concerned that this data risks becoming a giant data panopticon for the continent. But the greatest concern is how Europe's digital ID bears a striking resemblance to the front end of a Chinese-style social credit system. 7 years ago I wrote the booklet, A Biblical Point of View on Privacy and Surveillance. What was theoretical then is closer to reality now. That's why we should be concerned about digital IDs being developed in Europe. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are going to focus on a couple of different issues, and these are all on the website, so if you would like to read them. First of all, I posted this piece by Candace Owens in Conspiracy. We've posted it again. We're going to look at, as we go through here, the new anti-Semitism, Victor Davis Hanson. That was an article recommended by my guest a week ago when we got talking about the whole issue of how Tucker Carlson related in one way to a senator from the state of Texas, Ted Cruz, and how he related instead to another individual, Nick Fuentes, who thinks Hitler is cool and like Stalin. Okay, so he suggested this Victor Davis Hanson piece, and it is now there for you to read in its entirety. Since some of these behind a paywall, I pay for it. You can then read it. And then one that Dr. Matthews recommended by Ralph Reed, Evangelical Support for Israel is about more than theology. Yes, certainly there are so-called Christian Zionists that Tucker Carlson thinks are heretical, but nevertheless, getting back to Candace Owens, I mentioned it yesterday, but I wanted to get your thoughts because in your piece that appeared in The Hill, you talked about Candace Owens. You also talked about a couple of other people like Alex Jones and people like that. And you were really just asking the question, what about the conspiracy theories that are out there, and why are these individuals being given such a national platform with very little pushback? Your thoughts?
And you mentioned it just a minute ago. There are conspiracies. Conspiracies actually happen. Most of them aren't successful, but there are conspiracies. And so they do happen, but typically for a conspiracy to be successful, it has to be a small number of very, very dedicated people who are willing to in some cases, sacrifice their life for it, because the larger the group, and you mentioned this, the larger the group, the more likely it's going to slip out. And Washington, I keep telling people, Washington's a small place. It's a small town in some ways. And you have people who go to bars after work, and you have journalists who are going by there trying to pry news out of various people. If anything was going on, you typically find out about that at some point. And so issues like some of the things that are popping, the moon landing, questions about whether or not we actually landed on the moon, I think have more people believing we didn't land on the moon now than back then.
And just think of all the people that have to be part of that.
All the astronauts that were there, all the people at NASA and others who were in the Control Central and so forth, all of that, and the wives and so forth, the children of them. I mean, you can't keep a conspiracy. If that was really a conspiracy, you couldn't keep it going this long. And yet I still see people say, well, we couldn't actually go to the moon because you'd have to go through the Van Allen belt, and that would be radiation and so forth. It's amazing the kind of things that they come up with.
And again, that is unfortunately one of the things that Candace Owens has. Of course, she doubts whether or not they're dinosaurs because the only people that find dinosaur fossils are paleontologists.
Which actually isn't the case. Occasionally you'll have people who run across some dinosaur bones or jaws or teeth or something like that and take it to a paleontologist and find out.
Anyway, you could read that piece. We could spend all day on that. But the bigger issue, and I want to go to the Victor Davis Hanson piece, is, and again, since we're a little bit older, there was a time in which William F. Buckley had to address this issue. There were people that were associated with National Review and the things that William F. Buckley was talking about, and some of those individuals had anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish ideas, and he was willing to take a stand, as was Ronald Reagan and others, saying they are not part of our movement. And that has been if you will, a lesson that the left-wing anti-Semites have been able to not learn, and the leaders in the Democratic Party have not been able to learn. To their credit, over the last couple of days, it has been amazing to see, for example, Mark Levin had Ted Cruz on and Ron DeSantis. Joe Rosenberg did an entire program on what's going on with Tucker Carlson. I mean, you've got a number of individuals, plus all these articles here saying if there are people that are calling themselves conservatives, wrapping themselves in the flag that are anti-Semitic, that's not part of the Republican Party. But even Ted Cruz was saying there's still a lot of people that are afraid to speak out, but you know us, we don't shy away from those issues. And I think Victor Davis Hanson reminds us of some of the history and the fact that there's a need to make some very clear distinctions here on whether or not we're going to support the nation of Israel and support Jewish people.
Well, what Ralph Reed talks about in one of the articles that you have there is sort of the history of the Christian support for Israel. I think it is fair to say that after Israel became a state in 1949, that there was increased attention given to that, because it's now, okay, so Israel's back in, the Jews are back in Israel. Maybe the premillennial vision isn't as strange as some people had thought for the last couple thousand years. And a lot of evangelicals have become very strong supporters of Israel since that time, including Mike Huckabee, who is now the U.S. ambassador to Israel. I think he's the first Gentile ambassador to Israel. It's interesting. And Jerry Falwell was, I think, on the board of Tel Aviv University. I mean, you have evangelicals who have been very strong supporters, in part theologically, but also because of just the connections we have with them.
And again, one of the issues that certainly Ralph Reed's pointed out is there's more than just the whole idea of eschatology and prophecy there. First of all, Holly, I want to come to you as well, because it's strategic. If you're looking for a democracy in the Middle East, I know where to look. And if you're looking for a place which treats women well, I know where to look. If you want to have a place where both Jews and Arabs have the same rights, I know where to look. And it isn't in any of the countries that surround Israel.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head saying, yes, there are theological, there are eschatological reasons why we should be supporting Israel as Christians, as Americans. But there's just basic democratic principles that the state of Israel is implementing that are good for the people that live there, regardless of their religious affiliation. And I think that's important and should absolutely be mentioned in these conversations. And I think that is something that the Republican Party is doing a good job at mentioning, but we're not doing a good job of condemning people when they are, saying these anti-Semitic things. And I heard Ted Cruz speak last week, actually, and he did a great job. He spoke before a panel at the Federalist Society's National Lawyers Convention in D.C., and he just said, it's easy to condemn someone like Nick Fuentes, but are we going to be willing to say Tucker Carlson's name? And so I think it's good to commend what you guys are doing at Point of View and drawing attention to this and promoting this Victor David Hanson article, because I think what's going on right now within the party is not only divisive, but pretty deplorable of what some of our fellow conservatives are being willing to say about a fellow democratic state.
And, one of the things we've seen just in the last decade is a opening up of some of the Arab countries to working with Israel. And I got to give Jared Kushner and Donald Trump the credit for starting the Abraham Accords. I don't know that George W. Bush, I don't know if the time was right to do it then. The time was right when Mohammed bin Salman came into Saudi Arabia. But we're seeing some willingness among Muslim countries, Islamic countries, to be able to have at least peaceful relations with Israel. And that's something we've not seen in 2,000 years. So it's a very interesting time right now. And we can hope that it works out well. But because of Israel's strong, steadfast, and I'd have to say Netanyahu's willingness to stand firm on certain things, other countries are starting saying we need to work with Israel because we're not going to be able to overthrow Israel. We can't run them out. We can't force them to not be a country. And it's may may end up leading to a peaceful Middle East, or at least semi-peaceful Middle East.
Just as we go to a break, I'll just mention the Ralph Reed column, and we'll get back to it in just a minute, because he was talking about how President Trump has shown commitment to Israel's security that rivals that of his evangelical supporters. He relocated the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. I've had a chance to go and actually be there. Recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Never saw that coming, but he and Mike Pompeo made that possible. Provided critical support to end the war in Gaza, and bombed Iranian nuclear facilities, which, of course, gives heartburn to Tucker Carlson. So we'll come back and talk about some of those issues as well. But I might just mention, for those of you that maybe would like to know a little more about the theological issue, because we'll get into some others, last Wednesday, that was November 5th, we had Michael Rydelnik on, and he wrote his piece because he had seen how Tucker Carlson treated Ted Cruz and didn't feel that Ted Cruz did a good job of explaining Genesis 12 and all the other passages. And so then the book comes out, and then you also have the Nick Fuentes interview on Tucker Carlson. And so that is, I think, really one of the better theological issues from an individual who was Jewish, became a Christian, has been at Moody Bible Institute all these years, and I think gives a very good answer to some of those questions about replacement theology and even the issue of anti-Semitism. But we're going to come back and get into this in a little bit more detail, because it's in the news. You will have those conversations taking place, maybe even in your church, so that's why we're covering it here on Point of View. We'll be back right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I thought I'd separate them for just a few minutes. One is on this issue of anti-Semitism. The other is Israel. Now they overlap. But Victor Davis Hanson was trying to answer a question that has been going through my mind as well. We have seen, of course, anti-Semitism on the left. It has been well received. It is something we've seen on campus. We've seen individuals supporting Hamas, young students saying from the river to the sea, and we've even seen members of Congress. But how did this develop on the right? And his argument is first of all, they were seeing how, in some respects, anti-Semitism was being mainstreamed by the left on college campuses. They began to see, in some cases, that they could get away with that. And then because of the epidemic of diversity, equity, and inclusion and things like that, that maybe even talked about this idea of victimization. And as I've mentioned before, years ago I did a booklet on anti-Semitism, but after, of course, what took place with the attack of Hamas on Israel, updated it because now critical theory was saying, well, Israel is the oppressor and the individuals, the Palestinians, are the victims victims, and so that was the case. And then talking about some of the melting pot assimilation and some of that as well, and the fact that we are eventually going to probably have more Arab and Muslims in America than we'll have Jews in America. All of that led, and then also just a disagreement with foreign policy, whether we should even be involved with Israel. Nevertheless, it's a very long article, but Victor Davis Hanson at least begins to explain why, interestingly enough, we're seeing anti-Semitism on the right.
Yeah, and I'm going to sound again in this show like I just want to harp on young people as if I'm not, here to represent them. But I do think there is a trend among young, probably under 30, under 40 men that, some of these ideas appeal to them. You see people like Nick Fuentes and his listeners, I guess. I don't even know how to access Nick Fuentes content if I wanted to, and I don't want to learn, but I assume they're listening to his podcasts. And so much of it just infiltrates communities like that are looking for truth and are looking for good. And what they're getting is this just like hate-filled nonsense that they're hearing online, and it's creeping into as these people get older and they go into work and they start talking, it just starts to creep into society like that. But it starts really with a group that needs help being reached, and this is what they're being given, and it's not good.
And Kerby, there's always been an element of anti-Semitism on the right. It was usually small, so
and marginalized.
The Ku Klux Klan.
For sure.
They consider themselves conservatives. We didn't agree with that, but they did, and of course they were anti-Jewish. David Duke, remember, ran for governor of Louisiana as a former member of the Klan, and so you had this anti-Semitism that was out there, but it was generally in minor groups. You didn't see much of it at all, and especially once you have sort of an explosion of Israel's back, and you have new interest in prophecy and other things. There was sort of this growing fascination with Israel among people on the right, but now you have this sort of a neo-Nazi group moving up in. They're having that problem in Germany. We're seeing it arise here, and I'm just mystified by it. I mean, I'm mystified by the whole thing. The book that you show that I have a co-author. He's Jewish. Yeah. I'm just mystified by where this is coming from. I mean, you could, in many cases, you can't, Jewish people just fit right into American culture, and you wouldn't even necessarily know a Jewish person unless you ask them because they fit in so well. So I'm surprised by how all this is coming back.
What I think is interesting is we've talked about where it came from, where it's going, because first of all, I'll give you my conclusion. Richard Spencer is somebody that Dinesh D'Souza has interviewed on his movie, and he is a neo-Nazi. He calls himself that. He is an anti-Semite, and yet he endorsed Kamala Harris. Now, okay, so you got a guy that starts out, you would have called him a conservative, but he switched all the way over to supporting the Democratic nominee for president. There's a piece here in the Victor Davis Hanson idea that suggests maybe some more of that's going to happen, because he says the views of some of the anti-Israel right have become nearly indistinguishable from the global BDS, which is boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, while Jew hatred and generic racism are manifestly domestic in, again, Nick Fuentes' past attacks on so people like Charlie Kirk, and even criticizing J.D. Vance because they were putting his body on the plane, and then even criticizing the ethnicity of J.D. Vance's wife. So if you start down that road, you can kind of see where it might end up. And that's kind of intriguing, but that's something Dinesh D'Souza has been talking about.
Yeah, it was probably 12 years ago. I was at the annual CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, in Washington, and I was in the main hall where people were milling around, and I saw this group of people all sort of moving, and I asked somebody, what's happening over there? Oh, it was Richard Spencer had come to CPAC, and I was like, what's he doing here? And he wasn't given a place to speak. He wasn't allowed to do that. But as soon as he got there, you had this sort of group of people get around him and kind of follow him where he went. And I thought, I don't know where that's coming from, because that was, like I said, probably 12 or 13 years ago. So we hadn't seen this rise in the neo-Nazi aspect of it, but it was surprising to me. But there he was at CPAC.
Yes.
I think what's interesting is on this issue, and maybe this is true for more, but we're just seeing it play out right now, is that you often think of political opinions on sort of a horizontal spectrum,
right,
where you have the right on one end and the left on the other. And what we're seeing here is that maybe it's more circular than we think, because you're getting the furthest left that are these sort of pro-Hamas, anti-Jewish, the kind of students you saw protesting on college campuses are starting to look a lot like now what some of the very furthest right that are doing this a little more covert isn't the right word because they're saying it out loud now, but it's kind of started this other anti-Semitic movement within conservatives. And so you're seeing like those groups are meeting up and agreeing. They may have different ways of announcing it and different ways of presenting it, but it looks a lot more circular than...
And Holly's got an exact point. Back in the 80s, I was reading the book None Dare Call It Treason. Very far on the far right book. At the same time, they had the movie Reds on about John Reed, who's the only American buried in the Kremlin wall. And as I'm looking at watching the movie, I'm looking there thinking, this is... a lot of things he says sounds like what I was reading on this far right book. And I went and talked to one of the professors about that. And he said, yes, when you get out on the very extremes, they actually sort of come around and make a circle.
Yeah, and in the old days, we used to sometimes play a quote from Pat Buchanan, and then maybe Ralph Reed, or Ralph Nader, I should say, or even to this day, you can sometimes hear some individuals that sound like Bernie Sanders, even though they're part of the Republican Party. So, that is certainly the case. Just before we take a break, let me just mention also this piece by Ralph Reed is just a reminder that, yes, there are certainly people that do support Israel because of what Tucker Carlson calls Christian Zionism, and he refers to it as a heresy and a brain virus. But even if you, as we say so often, Dr. Matthews, even if you say, well, I'm going to ignore the Bible, Genesis 12, and whether it's an conditional covenant or whether it's an unconditional covenant and all the rest, there are just very good reasons why we have a strong support in the nation of Israel. And one of the quotes by Ralph Reed is from George Gilder. And going back like 2 studios ago, I did the interview with George Gilder on his book in 2009 called The Israel Test, in which he argues the incontestable facts of Jewish excellence constitute a universal test not only for anti-Semitism, but also for liberty and justice of the civil order. George Gilder has pointed out many times, if you want to find some of the greatest inventions in the world and find some of the highest percentage of individuals that are Nobel Prize winners, you go to what? The Jewish race.
Right.
And you go to the nation of Israel.
And they're disproportionately represented in the legal field, the healthcare field, academic world, entertainment, financial world, and they've made a major difference there in moving the country and the world forward.
Yes. Well, and again, when we were talking just the other day, the comments in Genesis 12 are, if you bless the descendants of Abraham, you will be blessed. If you curse them, you will be cursed. And it just so happened that my commentary that day talked about what had happened in places like Spain and what happened in England and what happened in Russia. And I was just looking at the economic issues, but my guest was pointing out, if you also look at how they treated the Jewish people, some of those declines are there as well, which I think just validates some of those biblical principles. So we'll continue talking about that, but 2 very good pieces, one by our good friend Victor Davis Hanson, also by our good friend Ralph Reed on the issue of anti-Semitism and evangelical support. Come back, just get into a couple of other issues, one of which, if you listen right now, you'll hear Penna Dexter's commentary on It's a Boomer World, and we'll talk about what that means, as well as maybe some final prayer targets right after this.
Like it or not, it's a boomer world. The huge and influential baby boom generation is still the most powerful presence in American society. Members of the boomer generation were born between 1946 and 1964. That puts President Trump, born in 46, at the generation's leading edge. As part of a recent symposium on boomers, cultural commentator Aaron Wrenn contributed an essay, The Boomers' World. He says boomers empowered the craziest of politics, but have also been the political balance holding back that crazy. Boomers are not a monolith. Many of us work against damaging phenomena like the green transition, DEI, and the LGBT agenda that were ultimately enacted on our watch. Boomers are often criticized for not stepping aside in a timely manner, not making room for succeeding generations and neighborhoods, organizations, politics, and corporations. Mr. Wrenn lists some boomer stereotypes. One, he says, is their refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of anyone's views but their own. To them, their own perspectives are simply the obvious truth. He continues, they don't think anyone else could possibly be as good at leading as they are. Another rap on boomers is they're selfish. They're leaving succeeding generations with a $37 trillion national debt, which Mr. Wrenn argues will be a millstone for their successors. Boomers have allowed mass immigration. Aaron Wrenn points out that when the boomers entered their 20s around 1970, America was at its lowest foreign-born population share ever. Yet, they created a world in which their own children will be racial minorities. Theologian R.R. Reno writes that early on, boomers cultivated a spirit of rebellion against the establishment. Ironically, boomers now look at the recent elections and worry that younger generations are driving us too far left. Okay, fellow believing boomers, we've done some damage. Since our generation still sets the cultural tone, we should use our influence to undo some of it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. One of the commentaries that we oftentimes post right now is by Penna Dexter, and you are probably going to be able to find it on the website. It's called Boomer World. Let me issue a disclaimer. As a matter of fact, the other day, my producer Steve was sending me something we've talked about before. Does it make sense to put anybody in a cohort? No, there is oftentimes as many exceptions as rules, and the younger you are, the more exceptions there are than the rules. Baby boomers born between 1946 and 64 all came together at a time when there was a lot of economic dynamism. There was maybe a little bit of reaction, and so she talks about the revolution. But this piece by Aaron Wrenn, who's been on the program with us before, points out some of the stereotypes, and I think some of them are appropriate generally, but let's recognize that there is an interesting irony because the baby boom generation really created what we call the generation gap. Mm-hmm. There was a time, and Dr. Matthews probably can remember this, when they said, don't trust anyone under or 30. Over 30, and then eventually became, don't trust anybody under 30.
They did a movie about that on Logan's Run where they put everybody to death who went to who got to 30.
And so again, that was because the previous generation, which we call the Builder generation, the World War II generation, the greatest generation, they lived with a different set of values, and baby boomers grew up at a time in unprecedented affluence, certainly a great deal more of sexual freedom and the rest, and so there was a real gap. Now the gap, as illustrated by this article, is between the boomers and the younger. And I see issue after issue, YouTube after YouTube, where he said, look what the boomers have done for us. They all have their house, but we can't buy a house. We're doing well financially, and they're not. And that, I think, is very appropriate. And even though many of us have been saying, back when the national debt was $1 trillion, mm-hmm. This is a problem. Now it's $38 trillion, and it is a problem, and there are solutions to that. But I think it illustrates again that, Holly, we've had this next generation roundtable because we wanted our listeners, whether they are younger or not, to hear from younger voices about their concerns about the future. And I think even though I'm the old guy around the table, I still have tried to represent what your generation is feeling, and I'm amazed at how many people sort of have this mindset, well, we got ours, so I'm sorry, I feel sorry for you, but I'm not going to do any changes. There are structural changes that need to take place, both in politics and economics, and Penna's piece kind of reminds us of that.
Yeah, well, as someone turning 30 in about 3 weeks,
oh, wow.
Hopefully no one's going to come and end my life because of it. But I agree with what Aaron Wrenn and what Penna are saying here. There's definitely the stereotypes that, boomers, what is it, that they're selfish or there's a lot of mass immigration. And I think probably, though, if we were sitting here having this conversation as boomers that were about to turn 30, we were probably looking at the stuff that happened to the greatest generation, and saying they really messed things up. So I think that there's a little bit of a cyclical nature to it of every upcoming generation thinks they know best, and we're all excited to have our turn. I think I'm probably not the best, Gen Z adjacent millennial to ask this question, because I told you guys during the break, my electoral history and the opinions that I hold probably look a lot closer to most boomers than some people in my generation. So I don't see that they've done all that much damage. I do think she's right. There is some stuff that needs to be undone. All that healthcare we just talked about, certainly let's do something about that. But
well, one of the things that happened is that as we lived through the socialism of China and Russia, we came to conclude as boomers, socialism doesn't work.
Right.
And you've got new people coming up now who are in their late teens, early 20s. They didn't get to see China collapse like we did. They didn't see the revolutions and the murders that went on when Russia and China and other places. We have seen those things, and we know they don't work. And so now you've got a new generation who hasn't learned from history and wants to try these ideas out with the notion of maybe if we finally do it right, we can make socialism work.
Yes. And again, I will issue that one last disclaimer. Even though we try to talk about different cohorts and different generations, the reality is that's starting to unravel. Gene Twenge, who was the one that coined the phrase Gen Z, I should say, and the idea of those actually being influenced by technology. Somebody said, well, okay, you've talked about the millennial generation, now you're talking about Gen Z. What comes after that? She says nothing. Because from now on, the generations, because of social media, because everybody has a different platform, there isn't the continuity. Dr. Matthews and I grew up at a time when there were three networks.
And maybe one independent.
Yeah. And there was usually one voice. Maybe it was Walter Cronkite. And everybody watched the moon landing, which really did happen. And everybody,
I don't know. I didn't see it.
And everybody watched the aftermath of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There's still some things like that in 9/11, but everybody is so divided now. You ask if a person has seen that TV program or they've watched that particular YouTube video. No, because it's so scattered and everybody has such a different experience that this idea of generational cohorts is starting to just evaporate.
It's really interesting because you had a handful of record labels that made the bands popular. So there was a handful of bands and we all knew who they were and the songs that they did. Now there's so much out there, whether you're talking about movies, entertainment, music, and so forth. It's hard to get that sort of collective experience anymore.
I think so.
It's only going to increase with the artificial intelligence and all of the, different generative technologies that are up and coming. But I think they're calling them Gen Alpha. That's what I heard someone the word the other day, and I thought, I can't believe we're already on to the next.
Yeah, and that is maybe going to stick, but I have some doubts. Gene Twenge has really just said this whole generational cohort, it didn't work all the way with baby boomers because there were some that were radicals and a lot that weren't. And I remember Rush Limbaugh saying, I'm never going to wear blue jeans because I'm not part of that generation, Well, that would be pretty minor, but now there is just so much diversity, ethnic diversity, theological diversity, political, economic diversity. I think it's going to be much harder. And so even though we still call it the Next Generation Roundtable, we recognize that that's kind of fragmenting and probably is the case. But I did want to end with some prayer requests, and one of those is certainly for our friends at First Liberty. I understand there's going to be oral arguments on December 3rd, and that's Gabriel Olivier, and that may be another very important precedent for you guys, won't it?
Potentially, yeah.
And so, again, that is one of the topics that you certainly want to address. If you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about some of these issues of religious liberty, go to firstliberty.org. And as I understand, there's a way in which people can get First Liberty Live, which is firstlibertylive.com, and learn some of those cases. But also there's a place at First Liberty where they can actually sign up for the newsletter, and I've got to scroll to the bottom and remember what it was. Because,
The Insider.
Yeah, Insider. Thank you. And so those are some resources there. Dr. Merrill Matthews, if people want to follow you, all they have to do is go to the Hill, right?
Go to the Hill, go to the Opinion, push on the button that says columnist, and my piece, The Opinion, appears there on Tuesday every week.
So again, we'll get into some of those as well. Next week, of course, we've got a number of very important issues. We're going to get into issues, apologetics, and a variety of others. So I hope you will join us next week here at Point of View. Most importantly, go to the website right now, and there are many of these articles. We've talked about everything from restoring the nativity scene to the end of the government shutdown, the Trump tariffs, and the giggling that was happening behind the scenes, some issues about health care, the new anti-Semitism, evangelical support for Israel, and of course the piece that Hannah Dexter posted on Boomer World. Also, if you see more viewpoints, you'll recognize mine today, which we never got to, is the digital IDs. You ready for a digital ID?
Oh, that's scary. I saw those. Yeah.
So we will cover some of that next week. But we're simply out of time. I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Enjoy the weekend. See you back here on Monday on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.